After my wife ran away with her boss, his betrayed wife showed up at my door. She said, "I own 5 companies. If you say yes, we get married tomorrow morning." It took me just 5 seconds to make the decision that changed everything. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. I needed barely 5 seconds to make the decision that would change everything. 5 seconds. The time it takes a broken heart to understand that it doesn't have anything left to lose. The woman standing at my door that night wasn't just any woman. She was Georgina, the wife of the man my wife had run away with hours before, owner of 5 companies, cold as marble and with a proposal that no man in his right mind would ever expect to hear. She told me, looking right into my eyes without any tremor in her voice, "If you say yes, we'll get married early tomorrow." And I said yes. But to understand why I made that decision in 5 seconds, I need to tell you what happened before. I need you to feel what I felt when I got home that afternoon and found that 11 years of marriage fit perfectly in 3 suitcases and a folded paper note on the kitchen table. I need you to understand what kind of man I was before that night and what kind of man I decided to be after. Because this story doesn't begin with Georgina, it begins with a shirt thrown on the floor. I'd arrive home at 6:30 in the afternoon, like every day. 44 years old, civil engineer, 15 years working in the same company, 11 of them married to the same woman. A neat, predictable life. The kind of life one builds brick by brick, believing that's enough for it to last forever. I parked the car, went up the 3 floors by the stairs like I always did, took the keys out of my pocket, and opened the door. The silence hit me before my eyes could process anything. It wasn't the normal silence of an empty house in the middle of the afternoon. It was another kind of silence. One that's heavy, one that smells different. Lilia's perfume, that gardenia scent that had welcomed me every time I crossed that door for 11 years, wasn't there. Instead, there was something like the air of a room closed for too long, dry, distant, alien. That's when I saw the shirt, a shirt of mine thrown on the hallway floor, as if someone had taken it out of some drawer in a hurry and simply dropped it without looking back. I bent down to pick it up without thinking. I folded it out of habit, and it was that tiny domestic gesture that gave me the first real warning that something was deeply wrong. I walked toward the bedroom. Lilia's closet was wide open. The empty hangers swung slightly, as if they still kept the movement of someone who'd taken the clothes out in a hurry. Her drawers were open too. The perfume bottle, the hand mirror I'd given her on our 5th anniversary, the small wooden box where she kept the earrings I'd brought her from a trip to Guadalajara. Everything had disappeared. On the bed, perfectly made, there was a sheet that wasn't even wrinkled, as if no one had slept there in days. I returned to the kitchen almost without breathing. There was on the table a white envelope with my name handwritten on it, Joaquin. Just that, without any decoration, without any flourish. My name written in her precise, controlled handwriting that had always seemed elegant to me, and that in that moment seemed like the coldest thing I'd ever seen in my life. I opened the envelope with fingers that barely trembled. I took out the paper, unfolded it slowly. It said, "I'm leaving. Don't look for explanations because there aren't any that'll change what I've already decided. I'm following Victor. This ended a long time ago, Joaquin. Only you didn't know it." I read it 3 times. Victor, her boss, the man Lilia had worked for during the last 4 years. The man who'd come to our house twice for dinner, who'd toasted with us at the company's year-end party, who'd shaken my hand with a wide smile every time we saw each other. That man. I dropped the paper on the table, sat in the chair, didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't break anything. I just stayed, sitting looking at that white paper on the dark wood of the table, listening to the noise of the wall clock that kept ticking the seconds as if the world hadn't just split in 2. Tick, tick, tick. 11 years, tick, 11 years of waking up next to the same woman, of sharing the same space, of building what I thought was a home. Tick. All that reduced to 4 handwritten lines on a paper that didn't even have an apology. I picked up the phone, called Lilia 4 times. All 4 times I went straight to voicemail. Her recorded voice, so familiar, telling me to leave a message. I didn't leave any. What was I going to say? I called Rodrigo, my friend of 30 years, the only lawyer I trusted blindly, The only man I could call at a moment like that without feeling ashamed. He answered on the second ring. I simply told him. Lilia left with Victor. There was a silence on the other end. Then his serious, low voice. I'm heading there. While waiting for Rodrigo, I started walking around the apartment as if looking for something I couldn't define. I went into the bathroom. Her side of the sink was completely empty. No creams, no toothbrush, none of those small objects that for 11 years had occupied that space so naturally that I'd stopped seeing them. Now their absence made them huge. I leaned on the edge of the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. A 44-year-old man with bags under his eyes, with his tie loosened, with an expression on his face he didn't quite recognize. How long had Lilia been planning this? Weeks, months. How many times had she been in that same kitchen, in that same bed, pretending everything was the same while inside she'd already left? Rodrigo arrived 40 minutes later. He brought a bottle of whiskey I hadn't asked for and an expression that told me he was also processing the news. We sat in the living room. I showed him the paper. He read it in silence. He left it on the table very carefully, as if it were evidence. He asked me, "Do you know how long they've been together?" I told him I didn't know anything, that I was the last to find out, obviously, that I'd been the blindest man in the world for who knows how long. Rodrigo nodded slowly. Then he said something I didn't fully understand at that moment, but that hours later would take on enormous weight. "Joaquin, I need you not to do anything impulsive tonight, because if what I suspect is right, this isn't just infidelity. This might be much more complicated than that." I didn't know what he meant by that. I asked him. He told me he needed to check a few things before talking, that he'd call me early the next day. He left around midnight. I stayed alone in that apartment that suddenly seemed completely strange to me. I sat on the living room couch with a glass of whiskey in my hand, looking at the wall, listening to the silence. At some point, I turned off the light. I don't remember deciding to fall asleep. Simply at some point, exhaustion won out over the pain. I don't know how long I slept. I know that when I opened my eyes, it was still night, and there was a sound, a dry, firm, repeated sound. Someone was knocking on my apartment door. I got up slowly. I walked to the door with my mind still cloudy. I looked through the peephole. It was a tall, elegant woman dressed in a cream-colored suit that at that time of night in my building's hallway seemed completely out of place. I didn't recognize her immediately, but when I opened the door and saw her face to face, with that direct gaze and that clenched jaw of someone who's made a decision and doesn't plan to back down, I knew who she was. Georgina, Victor's wife, looked at me without saying anything for 2 seconds. Then she spoke with a voice that didn't have a single crack of emotion. She said, "I know everything that happened today, and I have a proposal for you. If you say yes, tomorrow morning we get married. I'm the owner of 5 companies, and together we can destroy everything they built on our backs." 5 seconds. That was all I needed. I didn't invite her in right away. I stood in the doorway, looking at her, trying to understand if what I was seeing was real or if the whiskey and exhaustion were playing a cruel joke on me. Georgina didn't move, didn't lower her gaze, didn't show any discomfort at my silence. She simply held my gaze with that expression of someone who's calculated every word before saying it, and who doesn't have any intention of backing down. Finally, I stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. She walked into the living room as if she knew the place. She sat on the couch across from mine, crossed her legs, placed her bag on her knee, and looked at me with the same calm with which I imagine she signs million-dollar contracts. I sat down slowly, still processing, still carrying the weight of that night, still with Lilia's paper on the table 3 meters away. I asked her how she'd known where I lived. She told me Victor kept all his employees' files in his home office, that she had access to that office that afternoon, after finding the missing suitcases in the closet and the message Victor had left her on his phone. The first thing she did was go to that office and look for Joaquin Herrera's name in the files. She looked for me first. That told me something about her before she continued speaking. Georgina wasn't a woman who cried in a corner waiting for someone to rescue her. She was a woman who processed the blow in silence and immediately looked for the smartest way out. I asked her what she meant exactly about getting married tomorrow. She opened her bag, took out a thin sand-colored folder, and placed it on the coffee table between us. She told me to open it. Inside, there were 3 documents. The first was a summary of her properties and assets. 5 companies registered in her name, 4 of them inherited from her father, one she'd founded herself 8 years ago, a real estate portfolio with 4 properties in Mexico City and 2 in Monterey, an investment account worth approximately $2,300,000. The second document was a draft prenuptial agreement written that same afternoon, with specific conditions that protected her main assets, but granted me a direct participation in 2 of the companies as a strategic partner from day one. The third document was something I didn't expect to see. It was a financial report with my name on it. I looked at it without understanding. Then I began to read, and the cold I felt had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The report showed my name appearing as a guarantor on 3 different business loans, all signed in the last 18 months, all linked to a construction company called Inversions VR Capital, a company I'd never heard of, loans totaling $480,000 with my signature with my ID number. With my complete personal data, a signature I'd never made. I looked up from the document and looked at Georgina. She didn't seem surprised by my reaction. She seemed to be expecting it. She told me with a completely flat voice, "Victor has been using identities of people close to him for at least 2 years to back loans for a company that only exists on paper. You aren't the only one. There are at least 4 other people in the same situation, but you're the one with the highest committed amount. If those loans go into default, and they're going to go into default because that company doesn't have any real assets backing them, the bank will go after the guarantors. They'll go after you, Joaquin." I stayed silent for several seconds. $480,000 with my name, with my forged signature, and me not knowing it. 11 years building a neat life, paying my taxes, arriving at work on time, being exactly the kind of man who never gives anyone problems. And meanwhile, someone had been using my name to sustain a fraud. I asked her how she knew all that. She told me Victor wasn't as careful at home as he was at the office, that for years she'd noticed things that didn't add up, numbers that didn't match, trips that didn't correspond to any real business, meetings that were erased from the calendar before she could ask. That 6 months ago, she'd quietly hired a private auditor to review the financial movements linked to Victor's companies, that the auditor had found things that were still being documented. That afternoon, when she confirmed Victor had left with Lilia, she understood time was up, and if she didn't act fast, he'd move assets, erase tracks, and disappear before anyone could stop him. I asked her why she needed to marry me to do all that. Georgina looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly coldness, but wasn't warmth either. It was something in between, the look of someone who's going to tell you the unvarnished truth because they simply don't have time for anything else. She said, because in this country, when a wife sues her husband for fraud and hiding assets, judges tend to treat it like a domestic issue, like a complicated divorce. They take months to move a single piece. But if a harmed third party appears, someone with a fraudulent debt in their name, someone who can prove they were a victim of a real crime, the process changes completely. It becomes a criminal case, and a criminal case moves differently. She told me she needed me to be that harmed third party on paper, to file the complaint, to put my name next to hers before a judge, and that to protect me during that process, to guarantee I'd have access to the legal and financial resources needed to defend myself. The fastest and legally most solid way was marriage. I kept quiet for a long moment. Then I asked her the only thing I still hadn't asked. And what exactly do you gain from all this? Georgina. She didn't hesitate for a second. She said, I recover what's mine before he hides it. I destroy his public reputation before he builds a new narrative, and I make sure the next time Victor tries to use someone's name for his dirty business, that someone has enough power to crush him. She said it without raising her voice, without gesturing, with the same serenity with which she could have been talking about the weather. And it was in that moment, hearing her speak like that, looking at those documents on my table, thinking about Lilia and that cold paper she'd left me on the kitchen counter, thinking about my forged signature on 3 loans I never authorized, thinking about $480,000 that could destroy me if I didn't do anything. It was in that exact moment I understood the man I'd been until that night wasn't going to survive what was coming, that I had 2 options: sit around waiting for the world to crush me or stand up and crush first? I looked at Georgina and told her yes. I didn't sleep that night. Georgina left shortly after midnight with the folder under her arm and a single instruction: be ready at 8 in the morning with ID and formal clothes. Nothing else, without extra explanations, without sentimental questions, without any of those gestures that normally accompany the start of something between two people. Just that. 8 in the morning, ID, formal clothes. I closed the door and stood in the middle of the living room for a full minute without moving. Then I went to the bathroom, turned on the cold water tap, and washed my face 3 times. I looked in the mirror, the same usual man. The same tired face, the same under-eye bags, the same loosened tie, but something had changed in my eyes. I couldn't explain it precisely. It was as if something that had been asleep for a long time had just opened its eyes slowly, without rushing, but with a clarity that didn't accept negotiation. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, sat at the table with the mug in my hands, and, with Lilia's paper still there on the side, like an object nobody had decided to throw away yet, I picked it up, read it once more. I'm leaving. Don't look for explanations, because there aren't any that'll change what I've already decided. I'm following Victor. This ended a long time ago, Joaquin. Only you didn't know it. I folded it carefully, kept it in the kitchen drawer, not because I cared to keep it for sentimental reasons, but because Rodrigo had told me not to do anything impulsive that night, and I was starting to understand that this paper written in her handwriting, with her name implicit in every line, could be useful later. Everything could be useful later. I called Rodrigo at 7 in the morning. He answered immediately, as if he hadn't slept either. I told him everything. Georgina's visit, the documents, the loans with my name, the $480,000, the proposal, my answer. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. It was the silence of someone processing several things at the same time and sorting them out before speaking. Finally, he said, Joaquin, the loan thing is serious, very serious. If those signatures are forged, like Georgina says, we're talking about a federal crime. Identity fraud, malicious use of documents, possibly money laundering if the company is a shell. That isn't a complicated divorce. That's prison. I asked him if he thought I should trust Georgina. He told me he wasn't asking me to trust her as a person. He was telling me the documents she had were either real or they weren't, and that was the only thing that mattered right now. That if the numbers and signatures were verifiable, then Georgina was right about everything she'd said, and I had a much more serious problem than a broken marriage. I told him we'd meet that afternoon, that I first had to resolve something in the morning. I hung up, changed my clothes, looked in the closet for the only dark suit I had, the one I used for important presentations at work. I put it on slowly, as if I was getting ready for something that wasn't exactly a wedding, but wasn't just anything else either. At 8:05, I went down to the parking lot. Georgina's car was already outside, black, discreet, with a driver who didn't speak the whole way. Georgina was in the back seat, dressed in a dark wine suit, with her hair tied back and an expression that hadn't changed since the night before. She greeted me with a nod when I got in. Nothing else. We traveled in silence for 20 minutes. The civil registry we arrived at was a small office in a quiet neighborhood. Not the kind of place one imagines when thinking of a wedding, but that didn't matter either. At this moment, Georgina had called ahead. There was an official waiting for us. Everything was prepared with an efficiency that told me she'd done this before in terms of moving legal pieces quickly, not in terms of getting married like this. The procedure lasted less than 40 minutes. Signatures, stamps. An official who read the legal text in a monotonous voice while I listened to every word with an attention I'd never had at any important moment of my previous life. When it was time to sign, I took the pen, looked at the document for a second, and signed. Georgina signed next with that precise and controlled handwriting of hers, without any extra gesture. We left the building at 9:15 in the morning on the sidewalk under a morning light that still had that gray tone of cold mornings. Georgina turned to me and handed me a card. It was her corporate lawyer's card, a man named Rodrigo. I stopped. It was a different name. I told her I already had a lawyer, and I trusted him completely. She nodded without arguing. She told me that afternoon the 4 of us would meet, her lawyer, Rodrigo, she and I, to align the legal strategy before filing any complaint. I asked her if she had news from Victor. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened just a millimeter. She told me Victor had sent a message early that morning from an unknown number, saying she'd understand in time that everything had been for the best, that he wished her well, that he hoped they could resolve things in a civilized way. I asked her what she'd answered. She told me she hadn't answered anything, that answers aren't given by text. That afternoon, in Georgina's lawyer's office, was the first time the real size unfolded before me in all its extent. Rodrigo arrived with a laptop and a folder of documents he'd been preparing since morning. Georgina's lawyer, a man in his 50s with a slow voice and precise manners, put a second report on the table from the private auditor Georgina had hired 6 months ago. What that report showed was worse than I'd imagined the night before. Inversion's VR Capital, the shell company linked to the loans with my name, wasn't the only company of its kind. There were 3 more, all created in the last 4 years. All with similar structures, fictitious partners, real guarantors taken without consent, loans requested from different financial institutions. The total committed amount among all the companies exceeded $2 million. And there was something else, something Rodrigo found when he checked public records that morning with the data I'd given him the night before. One of those shell companies had Lilia registered as legal representative. My Lilia, with her full name, with her signature, with her ID number. The room went silent for several seconds. Rodrigo looked at me. He didn't say anything yet, but I could see in his expression he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about this story. I was recalculating it too, because in that moment, sitting in that chair with that document in front of me, the pain I'd felt the night before for the abandonment, for the emotional betrayal, for the empty suitcases and the cold paper on the kitchen table. All that started transforming into something different, something colder, sharper, more like the contained fury of someone who understands he wasn't just cheated on in love, but used as a tool in a scheme that had been running behind his back for years. Lilia hadn't left with Victor impulsively. It wasn't a story of passion that had overflowed the boundaries of marriage. It was a planned exit, an exit that had been prepared with time, with documents, with signatures, with paper companies, with loans someone would have to pay when everything collapsed. And that someone was me. Georgina watched me from across the table, not with pity, with something akin to recognition, as if she understood exactly what I was processing, because she herself had gone through that same moment of brutal clarity hours before. Georgina's lawyer spoke first. He said that with what they had at that moment, they could file a solid criminal complaint, that the private auditor was preparing a final report that'd be ready in 48 hours. That with that report, plus the forged loan documents and Lilia's registration as legal representative of one of the companies, the case was robust enough to request immediate precautionary measures, including freezing accounts and banning them from leaving the country. Rodrigo looked up from his laptop and said only one thing. If we're going to move this, we have to move it before they realize we already know everything, because the moment Victor's suspect a complaint is on the way, he'll start moving money, and money that moves fast is very hard to track later. I looked at Georgina. She was already looking at me. I asked her how much time we had. She said, less than we'd like and more than they think we have. The next 48 hours were the quietest and most intense of my life. There were no screams, no dramatic scenes, none of those moments one imagines when thinking about revenge. It was the exact opposite. It was cold coffee on desks full of documents. It was Rodrigo with red eyes from lack of sleep, checking commercial registries on his laptop. It was Georgina's lawyer talking on the phone in a low voice from a corner of the office, while taking notes with handwriting so small it looked encrypted. It was Georgina sitting across from me in a meeting room, turning pages of financial reports with absolute concentration, without saying a word that wasn't strictly necessary. And it was me learning to breathe inside all that, learning to transform pain into attention, learning that the best way to destroy someone who used you as a tool is to become the most informed man in the room. Georgina's private auditor was named Mario. He arrived at the office on the morning of the second day with a USB drive, a thick folder, and the expression of someone who's been carrying explosive info for weeks and can finally put it on the table as someone who's going to do something with it. He was a thin man in his 40s, with dark-rimmed glasses and a slow, technical way of speaking that contrasted completely with the weight of what he was saying. He sat down, opened the folder, and started speaking. What Mario had found in 6 months of silent auditing far exceeded what the initial documents had suggested. Victor wasn't simply an unfaithful man who'd stolen identities to back business loans. He was the center of a network of shell companies that had been operating systematically for 4 years. For companies created with fictitious partners or with real people whose data had been used without their knowledge. Loans requested at different banks using those companies as a front. The money came in, moved through 2 or 3 intermediary accounts, and ended up in a personal overseas account that Mario was still trying to track precisely, but had already identified in general terms. The total amount that had gone through that structure in 4 years was approximately $3,800,000. Rodrigo dropped his pen on the table when he heard that figure. Mario continued. He said Lilia wasn't just the girlfriend who'd left with the boss. Her name appeared as legal representative in one of the companies for the past 18 months. She'd signed documents. She'd been present at least 2 notary procedures linked to that company. She wasn't a collateral victim of the scheme. She was an active participant with direct legal responsibility. I listened to all that without moving. 11 years. I'd lived 11 years next to a woman who at some point, at some moment I hadn't been able to identify, had made a decision. She decided I wasn't enough. Not in the emotional sense, not yet, but in the practical sense. She decided there was a better way out and had started building it in silence, while I kept coming home at 6:30 in the afternoon, believing everything was fine. The pain didn't feel like pain anymore, it felt like info. Rodrigo took the floor after Mario. He said that with everything they had on the table, they could file a criminal complaint that same afternoon for identity fraud, malicious use of documents, and criminal conspiracy. That they could simultaneously request urgent precautionary measures before the judge to freeze the bank accounts linked to the shell companies and to impose an immigration restriction on Victor and Lilia to prevent them from leaving the country while the investigation lasted. Georgina asked how long it'd take the judge to approve the precautionary measures. Rodrigo said that with the documentation they had, if the judge was efficient, it could be a matter of hours, but there was a risk. If Victor had a contact inside the judicial system, he might receive a warning before the measures were executed. And if that happened, they'd have a very small window to move assets abroad. There was a silence in the room. It was Georgina who broke it. She looked at me and said, "There's something I haven't told you yet, something I found yesterday in Victor's home office." She opened her bag and took out an object none of us in that room expected to see. It was a planner, a physical black hardback planner with a year marked on the spine. She placed it on the table very carefully, as if it were fragile, as if she knew exactly the weight that object held. She said she'd found it in the false bottom of a desk drawer, that Victor had hidden it behind a loose board at the back of the drawer, the kind of hiding place someone uses when they don't even trust digital passwords, that inside there were notes with dates, names, amounts, and references to specific transactions written in Victor's handwriting, that some of those notes corresponded exactly to the movements Mario had identified in his audit. Mario took the planner with gloves, opened it slowly, turned pages in silence for several minutes while we all watched him. Then he looked up and said just one thing. This is a log. He kept a manual record of everything because he didn't want any digital trail that could be hacked or tapped. He thought paper was safer. Rodrigo smiled for the first time in 2 days. It was a small smile, without real joy, but with a very specific satisfaction. He said, "Paper is safer until someone finds it." That afternoon, we filed a complaint. Rodrigo and Georgina's lawyer entered the public prosecutor's office together with a folder weighing more than 2 kilograms. Mario accompanied them as an expert. Georgina and I waited outside in the car without talking much. At some point, she looked out the window and said in a low voice, almost to herself, that Victor had always believed he was the smartest man in whatever room he was in, that was what had ruined him. Not greed, not infidelity, arrogance, the absolute certainty that no one around him was capable enough to see him. I asked her how long they'd been married. She told me 14 years. I didn't say anything else. There was no need. Rodrigo left the building an hour and 40 minutes later. He walked to the car with that specific calm of lawyers who've just done something they know is going to work. He opened the door, sat down, and looked at me. He said, "The complaint is filed. The judge has the documents. Tomorrow morning, we'll check if the precautionary measures were approved. But Joaquin, I need you to understand something. From this moment on, when Victor finds out this is already moving and he will find out, the situation is going to change. He's no longer going to be the calm man, sending messages saying he hopes to resolve everything in a civilized way. He's going to go into survival mode. And people in survival mode do things they didn't do before." I asked him what exactly he meant. He told me to be ready, not to let my guard down, and to document any contact he tries to make with me by any means and forward it to him immediately. I nodded. Georgina said nothing. She looked straight ahead with that expression of hers I was already learning to read. It wasn't coldness. It was concentration. It was the look of someone who already knows what's coming and has been preparing for it for weeks, while the rest of the world thought she was simply a successful businessman's elegant wife. That night, I returned to the apartment alone for the first time since it all began. I sat in the living room, on the same couch where I'd been 2 nights before with a glass of whiskey in my hand, looking at the wall. But this time there was no glass, no whiskey, just me, the silence, and the new, strange certainty that the man who'd occupied that couch 2 nights ago didn't exist completely anymore. Something had begun, and there was no way to stop it. The call came at 6:15 in the morning. It wasn't Rodrigo. It wasn't Georgina's lawyer. It was a number I hadn't saved, but that I recognized immediately when I saw the last 4 digits. It was Victor's office phone number, the same number that had appeared on my screen dozens of times over the last 4 years when Lilia called me from work to tell me she'd be late. She had a meeting, not to wait up for dinner. I let it ring once, twice, 3 for times. It stopped. 30 seconds later, a text message arrived from the same number. It said, "Joaquin, we need to talk. This can be resolved without anyone getting hurt. Call me." I read it twice. I saved it in screenshots. I forwarded everything to Rodrigo with a single message. The first contact arrived. Rodrigo replied in less than 2 minutes. "Perfect. Don't answer anything. Every attempt at contact they make is one more piece that helps us. Let them talk." I got up, made coffee, and stood by the kitchen window looking at the street that was still almost empty at that hour. I thought of Victor. I thought of his smiling face at that dinner in my house, toasting with my glass, talking about projects, markets, opportunities. I thought of how many times he'd sat across from me, looking into my eyes, while inside he was calculating how to use me. The rage appeared for a few seconds, clean and direct, and then I let it pass. Rage was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. It was expensive, it cost attention, it cost clarity, it cost precision, and I needed all 3 intact. At 9 in the morning, I met with Georgina at her main office. It was the first time I'd entered that space, and the contrast with everything I'd lived the last few days hit me in a way I didn't expect. It was a full floor in a corporate building in Polanco, reception with white marble, staff greeting her with a mix of respect and something like genuine affection. A boardroom with a panoramic view of the city. It wasn't empty ostentation. It was the kind of environment built by someone who's been working seriously for decades and understands that spaces communicate authority before one opens one's mouth. Georgina received me standing in front of her desk. She had 2 phones on the table and a tablet with several screens open. She told me immediately that the precautionary measures had been approved early that morning, that the bank accounts linked to the 4 shell companies were frozen since 8, that the immigration restriction for Victor and Lilia was active since that same hour. I stood for a moment processing that. Lilia couldn't leave the country. Until yesterday, she was the woman who'd abandoned me with a cold paper on the kitchen table and whom I imagined in some luxury hotel without thinking of the consequences. Now she was a person with an active immigration restriction in her name in a criminal complaint for association in a fraud scheme. The world had changed size in 72 hours in a way I still had trouble fully grasping. Georgina continued. She said her legal team had identified a suspicious bank movement that morning, that someone had tried to transfer funds from one of the frozen accounts a few hours before the precautionary measure was executed, that the transfer hadn't been completed because the freeze arrived first. But the attempt remained registered, and that was relevant, because it proved prior knowledge of the scheme by whoever had tried to move it. I asked her if they knew who'd tried to make the transfer. She told me the order had come from a device linked to Lilia. The silence that followed was different from all previous silences, heavier, more definitive, because until that moment I still kept in some very small and very irrational place in my head the possibility that Lilia had been dragged along by Victor, that he'd manipulated her, that she was more victim than accomplice. It was a possibility I hadn't articulated out loud, even to myself, but it was floating there, the way things float when one doesn't want to examine them directly. That silence buried it. Georgina observed me for a moment. Then she said with a voice that didn't have any trace of cruelty, but no unnecessary softness either. "I'm sorry, Joaquin. I know this is hard to hear." I told her I wasn't sorry. I preferred to know that the only thing worse than the truth was to keep building on a lie. She nodded once, and we moved on to the next thing. The next thing was Carmina. Carmina was Georgina's personal assistant for 9 years. A woman in her 40s, discreet, efficient, with a loyalty to Georgina that was evident in every gesture. Georgina introduced her to me that morning with a single sentence. "Carmina knows everything I know, and sometimes she knows things before I do. If you ever need something and can't reach me, talk to Carmina." Carmina shook my hand firmly and handed me a thin folder. She told me it was an executive summary of Georgina's 5 companies, their structures, their main operations, and the points where my participation as a strategic partner would have the greatest immediate impact as established in the prenuptial agreement. I sat down to read it while Georgina took a call on the other side of the room. It was the first time since it all began that I stopped to think about that aspect of the situation, not the fraud, not the complaint, not Victor or Lilia, but what it meant what Georgina had offered me in concrete terms. 2 companies where I'd have direct participation from day one, a medium-sized construction company with active projects in 3 states, a real estate development company with 2 projects in the planning stage that needed technical direction. Exactly the kind of work I've been doing for 15 years as an employee for another company, but now from the other side of the table. I closed the folder, looked at Georgina from across the room, still on her call, speaking with that precise and controlled voice of hers, taking notes on her tablet without stopping listening. I thought about how strange all this was. 2 days ago, I was a man with a neat and predictable life who'd just discovered that life was an illusion. Today, I was the legal husband of the most powerful woman I'd ever exchanged a word with in my entire life, with my name on a criminal complaint as the victim of a millionaire fraud, and with a stake in 2 companies that together build more in a quarter than I'd earned in the last 5 years. It wasn't gratitude I felt. It was something more akin to responsibility, to the specific weight of understanding there was no turning back, and the only possible direction was forward with all the clarity I could maintain. Georgina finished her call and walked towards me. She told me there was something else I needed to know. That morning, after the precautionary measures were executed, Victor had called his personal lawyer. That lawyer had sent a formal letter to Rodrigo's office, saying his client was willing to collaborate with authorities in exchange for an agreement that reduced his legal exposure, that his client claimed to have acted under pressure from third parties and was prepared to offer additional info on others involved in the scheme. I asked her what that meant in practical terms. She said, "It means Victor is afraid, and when he's afraid, he looks for someone to hand over to save his own skin. And the easiest person to hand over right now is you, because your signature is on those documents, even if it's forged." She said it without alarm, as a fact, as a coordinate on a map, to keep in mind so as not to get lost. I asked her what we do about that. She told me what we do is exactly what we've been doing, that every piece we added to the file was a shield, that the more solid our legal position was, the less room Victor would have to build an alternative narrative where I appeared as an accomplice instead of a victim. Then she stopped for a moment and said something I didn't expect. She said, Joaquin, I know you got into this because you had no other choice, but I want you to know the way you've handled these 3 days tells me you're exactly the kind of person I need in this process. Not because you're the strongest, but because you haven't let pain cloud your judgment. And right now, that's worth more than anything else. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't respond at all. But something in those words settled somewhere inside me with a solidity I hadn't felt in days. Victor made his first big mistake on a Thursday afternoon. Until that moment, he'd acted with the caution of someone who knows he's being watched. Short messages, calls from unknown numbers, movements through his lawyer. Nothing direct, nothing that could easily be used against him. But caution has a limit when fear grows faster than intelligence. And on Thursday afternoon, Victor's fear overcame everything else. He sent me a message from a new number. This time it wasn't an invitation to talk. This time it was something else. It said, I know Georgina dragged you into this with promises she won't keep. She isn't using you as an ally. She's using you as a shield. When this is over, you'll be left with the debts, and she'll be left with everything. Think about it carefully, Joaquin. You still have time to get out of this clean if you talk to me before it's too late. I read it 3 times. Then I did the same thing I'd done with the first message. Screenshots. Immediate forward to Rodrigo. This time Rodrigo replied with more than instructions. He replied with a single line that told me everything I needed to know about how the situation was evolving. They're desperate. This is exactly what we needed. I took the message to Georgina that same afternoon. She read it in silence. Her expression didn't change, but when she finished reading, she left the phone on the table with a movement that was barely 1 millimeter more abrupt than usual. It was the only gesture that told me something in those words had touched something in her. Not fear, not doubt, something more like the exhaustion of someone who spent years dealing with the same form of manipulation and already recognizes it from afar. She asked me if the message had caused me any doubt. I told her no, that if I had wanted to believe Victor, I wouldn't have needed to wait for him to send me a threatening message. I could have believed him from the start and not married her 2 days ago. Something in her look changed a millimeter. She didn't smile, but she came close. She said, Good, let's keep going then. What followed that week was an escalation I hadn't fully anticipated, even though Rodrigo had warned me it had come. Victor's lawyer filed a formal brief with the public prosecutor's office, alleging his client was the victim of extortion by Georgina, that she'd threatened to fabricate evidence against him if he didn't transfer certain assets to her before the divorce was finalized, that the criminal complaint was an instrument of pressure and not a legitimate accusation. Rodrigo called me as soon as he received the brief. He read it out loud to me with that calm of his that I'd already learned to read as a sign things were under control, even if they seemed to get complicated. When he finished, he asked me what I thought. I told him it was exactly what Georgina had predicted, that Victor was going to try to build a narrative where she was the villain. Rodrigo said, Exactly. And what we're going to do is let him build that narrative while we keep adding real evidence. Because real evidence always wins against a narrative. Always. It just needs time to do it. Time, however, started moving in a strange way that week. Mario, the auditor, summoned us urgently one morning. When we arrived at the meeting room, he had 3 printed bank statements on the table and an expression that wasn't exactly alarm, but wasn't his usual technical calm either. He told us he'd identified a pattern in the financial movements of the last 6 months he hadn't seen before because it was hidden in transactions that at first glance looked like normal commercial operations. There was an overseas account, an account Victor had opened 18 months ago under the name of a company registered outside the country. That account had received periodic transfers from the shell companies during all that time. The accumulated balance in that account, according to the records Mario had managed to track so far, was approximately $900,000. Georgina heard that without blinking. I asked Mario if that account was included in the precautionary measures we'd obtained. He told me no, that the precautionary measures covered the national accounts linked to the shell companies, but that overseas account was different, that to freeze it they needed to initiate an international judicial cooperation process that could take weeks or even months. Weeks or months in which Victor could move that money wherever he wanted. Georgina got up from her chair, walked to the window, stood there for several seconds looking out. Then she turned and asked Mario with a completely flat voice, "How much time do we have before he realizes we found that account?" Mario said it was hard to know for sure, that if Victor had someone monitoring the judicial process, he could find out at any moment, that if he didn't, maybe a few days, a week at most. Georgina nodded, sat back down, and said, "Then we need to move it now." What came next was the part of the process I least expected. It wasn't a confrontation, it wasn't a dramatic scene, it was an entire afternoon of phone calls, formal emails, coordination with an international firm Georgina had as a contact for years, documentation traveling from one screen to another with a speed I struggled to follow. Georgina in the center of everything, directing every movement with a precision that left no room for error. I observed, learned, and at some point that afternoon, without having planned it, I started participating. There was a technical point in one of the shell company contracts that nobody had noticed yet. An inconsistency in the construction specifications declared as collateral in one of the loans. I saw it because it was exactly the kind of document I'd reviewed hundreds of times in 15 years as a civil engineer. I pointed it out to Georgina's lawyer. He studied it for 5 minutes and then looked up and told me it was relevant, that technical inconsistency proved the declared collateral didn't physically exist because the specifications corresponded to a project that had never been built. A project that had never been built, but had been used as collateral to get real loans. Rodrigo heard that and said, "You just added one more charge to the complaint." That night, when I returned to the apartment, I sat in the living room and stayed silent for a good while. Not thinking about Lilia, not thinking about Victor, thinking about that moment that afternoon when I'd seen something the others hadn't seen, when my knowledge, the knowledge I'd built brick by brick for 15 years in a job Lilia had once described as boring, had been exactly the missing piece. There was something strange and powerful in that. The phone vibrated. It was a message from Georgina. It just said, "Good job today, tomorrow at 8. I read it, left it on the table, and for the first time in days, I slept straight through until the alarm went off. The International Judicial Cooperation request took 9 days to activate. 9 days in which Victor kept moving pieces from his side of the board, believing he still had time. His lawyer filed 2 more briefs with the public prosecutor's office, one reiterating the extortion accusation against Georgina, another requesting the nullification of the precautionary measures due to alleged procedural flaws that Rodrigo dismantled point by point in less than 48 hours, with a legal response the judge admitted without objections. Every move Victor made was answered with a precision he clearly didn't expect, because Victor had built his entire operation on a fundamental premise, that the people around him didn't have the resources or the determination to truly face him. That premise was destroying him. On day 10, Mario arrived at the meeting room with a different expression. It wasn't the usual technical calm or the contained urgency of the previous week. It was something more like the specific satisfaction of someone who's just confirmed something they've been chasing for weeks. He sat down, opened his laptop, turned the screen towards us. The overseas account had been precisely located. Not just the number and the institution, but the complete history of movement since its opening, the transfers, the amounts, the dates, and something else Mario had found while tracking that account's most recent movements. 3 days prior, someone had tried to transfer $420,000 from that account to another account in a third country. The transfer had been blocked by the banking institution due to a compliance alert that had been triggered as a direct result of the judicial cooperation request we'd initiated. The money was still there frozen, waiting. Georgina heard all that without moving. Then she asked in an absolutely flat voice, "Who tried to make that transfer?" Mario said the order had come from a device registered in Victor's name, but the IP address from which it was executed corresponded to a location in the Polanco neighborhood, 3 blocks from the apartment where Victor and Lilia had been staying since this all started. Rodrigo closed his notebook, looked at me, then looked at Georgina. He said, "They can't move anymore. They're completely surrounded and they still don't fully know it." It was that same afternoon when I received the call I wasn't expecting. It wasn't Victor, it was Lilia. She called from a number I didn't recognize. When I heard her voice on the other end, I felt something that wasn't exactly what I'd anticipated feeling. It wasn't the sharp pain of the early days. It was something colder, more distant, like hearing the voice of someone you knew a long time ago in another life, and who no longer has the power to move you from where you stand. She said my name once. Joaquin, with her usual intonation, that way of pronouncing the two syllables that for 11 years had seemed familiar and now sounded like something that no longer belonged to me. I told her I was listening. There was a pause. Then she said she needed to talk to me, that there were things I didn't understand, that the situation wasn't what it seemed, that she'd had no choice, that Victor had pressured her, that she was afraid, that if I could meet her, just the two of us, without lawyers, without Georgina, she could explain everything. I listened to every word carefully, without interrupting, without reacting. When she finished speaking, I told her in a voice that surprised me for how calm it sounded, that any communication between us had to go through our legal representatives, that I wasn't going to meet her in any private context, and that if she had relevant info to offer, the right place to do it was at the public prosecutor's office. There was another silence, longer this time. Then she said, "What do they do to you, Joaquin?" I didn't answer. I hung up. I stared at the phone for a few seconds. Then I took screenshots, documented the call, and sent everything to Rodrigo. That she had relevant info to offer, she'd said. That meant she was considering talking. That fear had reached her side too. Rodrigo answered in minutes. Don't answer again if she calls back. Let her talk to her lawyer. This is speeding up. It was speeding up because 3 days later Mario found something else. There was a fifth name in the shell company's records, which until that moment had gone unnoticed. It wasn't a partner. It wasn't a legal representative. It was a notary. A notary who'd notarized several of the scheme's most important documents, including 2 of the contracts where my forged signature appeared. A notary whose participation in those acts was, at best, gross negligence and at worst, direct complicity. Georgina's lawyer said that had opened an additional line of investigation, that if the notary had acted with knowledge of the fraud, the scheme's responsibility expanded beyond Victor and Lilia and touched a public official, that this changed the nature of the case significantly. Rodrigo agreed. He said we'd file a separate complaint against the notary as soon as we had enough documentation to support it, that we didn't want to move prematurely and alert anyone who still didn't know they were being investigated. I listened to all that and took notes. In recent days, I'd become someone who constantly took notes, dates, names, amounts, cross-references between documents. It was a habit for my work as an engineer, that way of recording every data point, because in construction a forgotten detail can cost an entire structure. It turned out that same logic applied perfectly to what we were doing. One afternoon, Georgina saw me working on those notes and stopped to look at the page for a moment. Then she said it was a very orderly methodology. I told her it was simply the way I'd learned to process technical info. She nodded and said it was exactly the kind of order that had been missing in the people around her for years. She didn't say it as a compliment exactly. She said it as an observation. But in Georgina, observations and compliments sometimes occupied the same space. That week was also the first time we worked together on something that wasn't directly the legal case. There was a technical problem in one of her company's construction projects. A supplier had delivered specs that didn't match the contract, and the project manager wasn't sure how to document the breach to protect the company in a potential dispute. Georgina asked me if I could review it. I reviewed it that same afternoon. I prepared a technical report with the documented inconsistencies, the relevant contractual clauses, and an action recommendation. I gave it to her the next day. Georgina read it in silence. She asked 2 technical questions I answered easily, and then she passed it to her legal team with a direct instruction. That night, she sent me a message saying the report was exactly what we needed. Thanks. It was the first time she'd thanked me for something. I saved it without replying. But something in that small and concrete exchange told me that what I was building these days wasn't just a legal defense against fraud. It was something else, something that didn't have a clear name yet, but felt more solid than anything I'd built in the last 11 years. And then came the news that changed the pace of everything. Rodrigo called on a Friday morning with a voice that had a different energy. He said the public prosecutor's office had issued an appearance order for Victor and Lilia. that they had 72 hours to appear before authorities, that if they didn't appear voluntarily in that period, the order would become an arrest warrant. 72 hours. I asked Rodrigo if he thought they'd appear voluntarily. There was a brief pause. Then he said, Lilia, maybe. Victor, I doubt it. And if Victor doesn't show up, what comes next is going to be very public and very loud. I hung up. I stood in the middle of the living room with the phone in my hand. 72 hours. The clock had started ticking in a way that had no pause anymore. The first 24 hours of the period passed in silence. No movement from Victor's side, no response from his lawyer to the public prosecutor, no contact with us, just silence. And the silence of someone who's being sought has a different texture than normal silence. It's tenser, heavier, like the air before a storm that still hasn't decided whether to break or not. Rodrigo monitored the process from his office. Georgina's lawyer had direct contact with the prosecutor assigned to the case. I stayed in Georgina's office that morning reviewing technical documentation for the construction projects, trying to keep my mind occupied on something concrete while the clock ticked. Georgina entered the meeting room mid-morning with Carmina behind her, an expression I already knew how to read as a sign something had happened. She sat down. She told me Lilia had called the prosecutor's office that morning through her lawyer, that she was willing to appear voluntarily, that she wanted to negotiate a plea deal in exchange for reduced charges, that she was willing to offer info on the entire scheme, including details that hadn't appeared in any document yet. I stayed silent for several seconds. I asked Georgina what that meant for the case. She told me it depended on what info Lilia had and how relevant it was to the more serious charges. That if she could confirm details about the scheme's origin, the instructions Victor had given, and the notary's specific role, her testimony could be the piece that turned a solid case into an irrefutable one. Then she paused and said something I didn't expect. She said the prosecutor wants you present when she testifies, not as a formal accuser yet, but as a direct witness to the damage. Your presence in that room might influence Lilia's willingness to be completely honest. I asked her if that was a good idea. She told me it was a recommendation that I decided. I thought about it for a moment. I thought about what it'd mean to sit in a room facing Lilia after everything that had happened. Not with rage, not with the intention of hurting her, but simply as what I was in that process, a person they'd used and who had the right to be present when the truth was spoken aloud before an authority. I told her yes. Lilia's testimony was the next morning. The prosecutor's office room was small and functionally cold. White walls, dark wooden table, uncomfortable chairs, a window overlooking an inner courtyard that had nothing to do with the weight of what was going to happen in there. I arrived with Rodrigo 15 minutes early. We sat on one side of the table. The prosecutor reviewed documents in silence. Lilia entered 5 minutes later with her lawyer. It was the first time I'd seen her since finding the empty apartment. She was different, not physically, though there was that too. The lack of sleep marked on her face, her clothes less neat than usual. She was different in something harder to define, as if the space she'd occupied in my life for 11 years had suddenly shrunk to something more proportional to reality. She was a 40-year-old woman sitting in an uncomfortable chair, facing the consequences of decisions she'd made fully aware. She looked at me when she entered, just for a second. Then she looked away. I didn't say anything. I didn't greet her. I just held her gaze that second and then looked forward as if she were anyone else in that room. The testimony lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Lilia spoke with a voice that was initially controlled and kept losing its composure as the questions progressed. She confirmed she'd known about the shell company scheme from the beginning, that Victor had presented it to her as a tax optimization operation. That's what he called it, and she'd agreed to participate believing the legal risk was minimal. That over time she'd understood it was much more than that, but by then she was already too involved to get out without consequences. She confirmed my name had been included in the documents by Victor's direct instruction, that he'd said he needed a guarantor with an employee profile, stable, without problematic financial background, that she provided my data because she had it handy and because Victor had assured her the loans would be paid off before anyone noticed anything. I listened to that without moving a muscle. She'd used me knowingly with my data in hand and had believed no one would notice anything. She also confirmed the notary's role. She said the man knew exactly what he was certifying, that he'd received cash payments for his participation in 3 notarial acts linked to the scheme, that she had the receipts because Victor, with that arrogance of his of keeping a record of everything in his physical planner, had noted even those payments. Rodrigo passed me a note under the table while Lilia was talking. It said, "The planner covers everything. We're done." When the testimony concluded, the prosecutor informed us that with that testimony plus the existing documentation, the charges would be expanded. Then an arrest warrant for Victor would be issued in the next few hours since he hadn't appeared voluntarily within the established period. That the notary's case would be transferred to a specialized prosecutor's office. We went out into the hallway. Rodrigo shook my hand with a firmness that said more than any word. Then he walked away to make calls. I stayed alone in that hallway for a moment. Lilia came out of the room behind her lawyer. When she passed in front of me, she stopped. Her lawyer kept walking a few steps without noticing. She looked at me. There was something in her expression that wasn't exactly regret, but wasn't the coldness of the paper she'd left on the kitchen table either. It was something in between, the specific gesture of someone who wants to say something and doesn't know if they have the right to say it. She said my name quietly, Joaquin. I looked at her. She said, "I'm sorry." 2 words, the same 2 words that hadn't appeared anywhere on that folded paper on the kitchen table. The same 2 words that 11 days ago I'd have needed to hear with an urgency that'd have split me in 2. Now I heard them and processed them as what they were. 2 true words, probably, but 2 words that arrived 11 days late and several $100,000 late and 11 years late. I told her I heard her, nothing else. Her lawyer came back looking for her. She left. I walked out of the building into the streetlight and picked up the phone to call Georgina. She answered on the first ring. I told her the testimony had been complete. We had everything we needed. The arrest warrant for Victor was a matter of hours. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then she said with that voice of hers that never broke, "Good, then tonight we rest. Tomorrow we finish this." I hung up. I stood on the sidewalk looking at the street for a moment. The midday sun fell with a clarity that after days of interiors and documents and closed rooms felt almost violent. I wiped my hand over my face. I breathed slowly. Tomorrow we finish this. But what I still didn't know was that finishing this was going to mean something completely different from what anyone in that story had anticipated, that the last piece of the board hadn't fallen yet. And when it did, it was going to change not only the outcome of the case, but the entire direction of what came next. Victor was arrested on a Tuesday morning. There was no drama, no chase or cinematic scene. It was something much more mundane and therefore much more definitive. 2 agents from the prosecutor's office arrived at the Polanco apartment where he and Lilia had been staying. They knocked on the door. Victor opened. They showed him the warrant. He looked at the document for several seconds with that expression people have when they understand the moment they'd been postponing finally arrived and there's no longer any possible move. He got dressed in silence, left with them without resistance. Carmina sent me a message with the news at 9:43 in the morning. A single line, "He's already arrested." I read it sitting in Georgina's office, where I'd arrived early to review some construction contracts. I left the phone on the table. I looked out the window for a moment. Outside, the city remained exactly the same as always. Traffic, buildings, people walking around knowing nothing about anything. The world completely indifferent that something that had taken weeks to build had just closed with the simplicity of a door that opens and closes again. I didn't feel euphoria. I didn't feel relief exactly. I felt something more like a weight being lifted. Like when you've been carrying something for so long you don't remember what it feels like not to carry it, and suddenly you drop it, and your body takes a few seconds to process that it isn't there anymore. Georgina entered the office 10 minutes later. She looked at me. I showed her Carmina's message, even though she already knew. She nodded once. She sat across from me, and for the first time since I'd met her standing in the hallway of my building in that cream-colored suit at midnight, I saw something different in her expression. It wasn't victory, it wasn't cold satisfaction, it was something more human than all that. It was the real exhaustion of someone who sustained massive tension for a long time and can finally let their breath out. It lasted only a moment. Then she went back to being Georgina. She said, "The trial will take months. Rodrigo and my lawyer will handle the procedural part. We continue with the companies." I told her I agreed, but there was something I needed to tell her before we moved forward. Something I'd been processing for days, and that morning, with the news of Victor's arrest, had finally taken shape clearly enough to be said out loud. I told her I needed to talk to her about something that wasn't the case. She looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly guarded, but wasn't totally open either. It was the expression of someone not used to conversations taking unexpected directions. I told her what we'd built these past weeks, the legal strategy, the collaboration on the projects, the way we'd learned to work together, was something real and solid that I genuinely valued, that I didn't regret any of the decisions I'd made since that night she knocked on my door. But I needed us to talk about what this was and wasn't about what came after the dust settled and the lawyers closed their folders. Georgina listened without interrupting. When I finished speaking, she stayed silent for several seconds. Then she asked what exactly I meant by that. I told her I meant I wasn't the kind of man who could live indefinitely inside an agreement without knowing what that agreement was in human terms, that the legal contract was clear, the strategy was clear, but what existed between two people who got up every morning and worked together and made decisions together and faced difficult things together, that wasn't in any document and needed some kind of name or direction. Georgina looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "Joaquin, when I went to your door that night, I didn't go because I needed a legal shield. I went because in 6 months of private auditing your name appeared dozens of times in those documents, and every time it appeared there was a coherence, a cleanliness, a way of doing things that contrasted completely with everything Victor represented. I went because I wanted to meet the man who'd lived next to all that without getting dirty. And what I found was exactly what I expected to find, and that was more dangerous to me than anything else in this process, because I don't allow myself distractions." I stayed silent. She said, "I'm not an easy woman. I won't pretend I am. I have 14 years of a failed marriage on me and a way of functioning that isn't going to change overnight. But if you're asking me if this is just a strategic agreement for me, the honest answer is it stopped being that several days ago." She said it without melodrama, without lowering or raising her voice, with the same precision with which she said everything else. I told her that was enough. I wasn't asking for more than that. She nodded, and we went back to work. 3 weeks later, Victor's preliminary hearing confirmed the main charges: identity fraud, malicious use of documents, criminal conspiracy. The notary was indicted for complicity in fraudulent notarial acts and immediately suspended from his duties. The frozen accounts, including the $900,000 abroad, remained under judicial custody pending a final resolution. Victor's defense lawyer tried in the hearing to introduce the narrative of extortion by Georgina. The judge dismissed it in less than 10 minutes, given the volume of documentary evidence presented. I was present at that hearing, sitting next to Rodrigo. I saw Victor across the room. He was different, not in the physical sense, but in something deeper. His posture, the way he occupied space. The man who'd enter my home for dinner with a wide smile and a firm handshake. The man who'd toasted with my glass and looked into my eyes while planning to use me. That man wasn't in that chair anymore. In his place was someone smaller, someone who finally occupied exactly the space he deserved. I didn't look at him with triumph. I looked at him with the specific indifference of someone who's already closed that account and has more important things to direct their attention to. Lilia reached a plea deal that reduced her charges in exchange for her full testimony. She'd receive a suspended sentence with strict supervision conditions. She wouldn't go to prison, but she wouldn't be the same person she was before all this came to light either. Her name was in the records. Her participation was documented. That wouldn't disappear. The day I left that last hearing, I walked alone for a while through the downtown streets before taking taxi. I didn't have a specific destination. I just needed to walk. I needed to feel the pavement under my feet and the ordinary noise of the city around me and silently process what this month had been, what I'd lost, what I'd found, what I'd stopped being and what I was starting to build. I'd entered this month being an invisible man, the kind of man who arrives on time and pays his taxes and trusts the wrong people and never imagines that can be used against him. I'd come out being something else. Not a hero, not an avenger. Simply a man who'd learned that intelligence applied with patience is worth more than any impulse, that pain can become clarity if one decides not to drown in it, that sometimes life forces you to rebuild yourself, and the only real question is if you have the courage to do it right. That night, Georgina and I had dinner together for the first time without documents on the table, without planners, without pending strategies. Just two people sitting across from each other in a quiet restaurant with a bottle of wine and the rare, new space of having nothing urgent to resolve. At some point during that dinner, she raised her glass to me without saying anything. I raised mine. There was no toast, no grand words or theatrical gestures, just two glasses meeting in the center of the table with a clean, brief sound. Sometimes it's how the things that last begin.